Hello, my friends, hello, and welcome once again to stately Vaughan Manor, where it's the Robert E. Howard Show. It's the Robert E. Howard Show once again, where this week, and actually next week too, we're going to be veering away from Conan for a bit to talk about other things. And the thing we're going to be talking about today is the Robert E. Howard Library, which was published by Baen Books in the mid-90s. And it was important for a couple of reasons. They are easily recognizable because of their distinctive spines. This is a set of mass market paperbacks that Baen printed. And like I said, they were notable for a couple of different reasons. So I felt like they deserved to be talked about on their own. And one of the things that got me thinking about them was the passing of cover artist Ken Kelly a few months ago. Ken Kelly, who did a lot of Conan covers and a lot of Robert E. Howard covers. So that got me thinking about these books in just about that time of my life, I guess. Looking for Robert E. Howard books that were all out of print. The 90s was a time that it was a dark time if you were a Robert E. Howard fan, because Robert E. Howard was kind of a forgotten man in the 90s. Conan was still being printed, but it was all Tor pastiche Conan. None of the original Conan stories were in print at the time in the 90s, as far as I'm aware. The L. Sprague de Camp set of Conan books had gone out of print, believe it or not. And Tor's Conan was the Conan that people knew, and Robert E. Howard's name wasn't on any of those. Robert E. Howard's fiction pretty much was just gone, unless you were haunting the used bookstores like I was, searching for this stuff. And this is a thing that happened in the late 80s and into the 90s. And it didn't just happen to Robert E. Howard, happened to Edgar Rice Burroughs as well, and actually a lot of science fiction writers were kind of forgotten around this same time for some reason. I'm not sure exactly why this happened, but it happened. And so Baen Books did publish a Robert E. Howard collection in the late 80s. In 1987, they published this book. This is Cthulhu, the Mythos, and Kindred Horrors by Robert E. Howard. So obviously this looks like a Lovecraft book. It's got Cthulhu there. Cthulhu. And this looks like a book by Lovecraft, but it's a collection of Robert E. Howard horror stories, basically. And some really, really good ones. Some of his best horror stories are in here. It's a fantastic collection. It's got The Black Stone, one of his very best stories in there. It's got The Thing on the Roof, The Valley of the Worm, great fantasy story. The Shadow of the Beast, Old Garfield's Heart, People of the Dark, Worms of the Earth, possibly his greatest horror story ever. Pigeons from Hell, which has a funny title but is a magnificent story. So this collection was dynamite. And it sold well. This is actually the second printing from 1989. Was it? Yeah, this was printed in 1989. So they did well with this volume. And it was the only thing out there at this particular time. I was really happy to see it. Kind of surprised at the packaging, but maybe they felt, if it looks like Lovecraft, it'll sell better. Because, like I said, Robert E. Howard's name wasn't big at this particular time. And then, for a few years, nothing. Nothing. So this was kind of like the last major Howard publication for a while, I believe. It did have a great introduction by David Drake, who was very popular at the time and was a big Robert E. Howard fan. So there was nothing until 1995 when Baen Books decided, possibly because of the success of the Cthulhu volume, to publish a whole line of Robert E. Howard books. All the non-Conan stuff, basically. The non-Conan Howard fantasy stuff. And their first volume was this one. This is Cormac Mac Art. So there are a couple things to mention about this initial volume. One, I was very happy to see it. I was thrilled that Robert E. Howard was being published again. And these books have always been kind of important to me because for a few years, these books were the best versions you can get of the Kull, the Bran Mak Morn, or the Solomon Kane stories. They were until Del Rey came along and published this series of books, which is still the gold standard of Robert E. Howard publications. This series of books is magnificent, has not been bettered since. I would like it if there were a new publication of Robert E. Howard, but for the moment, this is still the best. But until the early 2000s, we didn't have that. We had this set, this mass market set from Baen Books, which was printed about as cheaply as you can possibly print a mass market paperback. The paper quality is abysmal. I've never seen a set of these books that didn't look like they were 100 years old. And they darkened up immediately, like right away. It looked like this right away. I mean, in no time at all, it just looked like it was 100 years old. Because Baen Books at the time, and it wasn't just this set of books, Baen Books printed books about as cheaply as possible. I don't know where they got their paper stock, but it was bad. So very cheaply printed books. But the books themselves are really cool. You've got the, like I said, the Ken Kelly cover. You've got Cormac Mac Art there, who is wearing skin-tight chainmail. Skin-tight chainmail was a Ken Kelly thing. Ken Kelly, who did a lot of these fantasy covers, he also famously did covers for a couple of Kiss albums, for which he is fondly remembered. But he did a lot of Robert E. Howard covers, and that includes this set of books. Cormac Mac Art is an interesting place to start with this series, because Robert E. Howard didn't write a lot of stories about Cormac Mac Art. And in fact, none of them were published during his lifetime, and some of the better stuff was left unfinished. And I think that perhaps the reason Baen started with this is because of this. All new story by David Drake. There's so little Cormac Mac Art that they commissioned David Drake to write a whole new story, which takes up the first chunk of this. So you've got a brand new story by David Drake. So this series, oddly enough, doesn't even start with Robert E. Howard. It starts with David Drake. And so that's the first story in the volume, which is The Land Towards Sunset. The second story, Tigers of the Sea, was left unfinished by Robert E. Howard, and David Drake finishes the story. David Drake has a note on the text where he seems a little uneasy about this, and he lets you know that there might be a little too much David Drake in this Robert E. Howard volume. But like I said, I think because David Drake was popular at the time, more popular than Robert E. Howard was, Baen decided to go with this volume first, just because David Drake's fiction was in here and his name was on the cover. So maybe that's why. Interesting place to start. Normally with a Robert E. Howard set, you think you would start with Solomon Kane or Kull, if, like this set, you're not doing Conan. I believe they didn't have the rights to Conan, or didn't think that they had the rights to Conan at the time. So this was all the non-Conan stuff. The second volume was Kull, and this is the first complete edition of Kull. Really cool Ken Kelly cover of Kull. And for a long time, for years, this was the best edition of Kull you could get. And up to this point, this was the best edition of Kull. It didn't have any of Lynn Carter's editions in here. This is all Robert E. Howard in this particular volume, which for Kull had not been done up to this point. And also, these were the original Robert E. Howard versions of the Kull stories. So this was a good set of books for this reason. And this was an excellent volume of Kull. Again, looks like it's 100 years old. But it's a great book, and I was really happy to see it, and it was a great edition of Kull for a long time. Next came Solomon Kane. Solomon Kane, one of Robert E. Howard's greatest characters. I love Solomon Kane. This is interesting. Again, first complete edition, all the Solomon Kane stories in one volume. But this has some stories that were fragments that were finished by Ramsey Campbell, the famous horror writer Ramsey Campbell. And Ramsey Campbell does the introduction to this volume. Years before, actually, Ramsey Campbell was asked to finish some Solomon Kane stories. And so he did. And those versions ended up in here. So this is a cool volume just because of that. The stories that were finished are left as Robert E. Howard wrote them. Ramsey Campbell's introduction to this volume is great. He gives an introduction where he talks about this historical period where the Solomon Kane stories took place. He completely immersed himself in that period in order to write these stories, or to finish these stories, I should say. And so he knew all about the weapons and the time period and what things would actually be like for Solomon Kane. It's interesting. Years later, the Del Rey edition of Solomon Kane would just leave those fragments as Robert E. Howard wrote them. But this is interesting just in case you're really a fan of Ramsey Campbell, as I am. So he actually did an excellent job with these. And he also wrote the movie novelization of Solomon Kane. And he did a great job with that too. That's actually an excellent book. So this is interesting just because of that. It's still valuable to me because of that, because I like Ramsey Campbell and Robert E. Howard. And so this is an interesting edition of Solomon Kane. And again, like I said, all the stuff that Robert E. Howard actually finished, it's all left as he wrote it in this book. So it's a good Solomon Kane volume. And then Bran Mak Morn. This is the first complete edition with an introduction by David Weber. Bran Mak Morn, the Pictish king. This, I believe, has everything from... Yeah, it even has Kings in the Night in here, which is a story that is the story where Bran Mak Morn teams up with King Kull. That was a great story. This volume also has the Gods of Baal Sagoth on here because that was kind of a sequel to The Dark Man. And so while that is not a Bran Mak Morn story, it's still a really good story. So it's cool that it's in here. So again, the first complete edition, and for years, this was the best edition of Bran Mak Morn that you can get. Still a really cool book. This is one of the best covers, I think, that Ken Kelly did for this series. So this is excellent. And then we've got 3 volumes of Robert E. Howard's fantasy and horror stories. This one is Eons of the Night. Excellent cover there. And this one has some really great stories in it. It has The Twilight of the Grey Gods, which is a great fantasy story. It has Marchers of Valhalla, another great fantasy story. And it also has, well, it's got Wolf's Head, which is an awesome werewolf story, but it also has Spear and Fang in here, which is rare. That's Robert E. Howard's first published, or first professionally published fantasy story, which was actually... It's really not even a fantasy story. It's just a story about cavemen, basically, that showed up in Weird Tales. It's a cool story. It's an interesting beginning, and it's interesting to see Robert E. Howard's first published story. You would never know it from this volume because it's just in the middle there, but it's cool that it's in there. Then we get Trails in Darkness. Trails in Darkness. This cover is cool because you got a giant ape, and Robert E. Howard characters were always fighting giant apes. So, you know, it's cool that that's there. A lot of cool stories in here. You've got Black Canaan, Kelly the Conjure Man, The Valley of the Lost, Black Hound of Death. So this has a lot of the Weird Tales horror stories in there. And their final volume was this one, Beyond the Borders, another collection of weird fantasy and horror stories. Again, a bunch of really cool stuff. This has the dream snake, the hyena, the cobra in the dream, dig me no grave, the haunter of the ring, the voice of El Lil. It has a bunch of really cool stuff in here. So this set of books, which came out between 1995 and 1996, if you were a Robert E. Howard fan, this was it. This was all that was published during the 90s, as far as I'm aware of, in a professional publication. And they were, like I said, extremely cheaply published in these mass market paperbacks, but at least we had them. And like I said, this was the best versions of some of these books until the Del Rey books. The last three books, the anthology books with the different horror and fantasy stories, were really cool because these were some stories that had not been published for years and years. And they were some interesting stories from Robert E. Howard. Oddly enough, they didn't have Pigeons from Hell in this set of stories, or in this set of books. Which is odd, because that's one of his greatest stories. One of his best horror stories. That's the only one I could think of that really should have been in here that wasn't. Otherwise, it's a dynamite set, and I've probably talked enough about him. I will catch you next week at this time, hopefully, for the Robert E. Howard Show. Catch me tomorrow, and I will see you next time.